I stepped off the plane at Cleveland Hopkins, my carry-on bag feeling lighter than it should. Inside that worn leather satchel was a single piece of paper that would change everything. It was a wire transfer receipt for $4 million. I was 70 years old, and I had just sold the niche logistics firm I had started in a rented garage in Little Rock 40 years ago. My name is Arthur Vance. I spent my life as a mechanical engineer, building a legacy out of steel and sweat, thinking I was securing a future for the people who shared my blood. The flight from Arkansas was long, but my mind was moving faster than the plane. I had it all mapped out. I was going to walk into my son's house in Cincinnati and tell them the struggle was over. I was going to pay off their mortgage, clear the high-interest debt that kept my daughter-in-law, Sarah, on edge, and set up a trust for my 2 grandsons that would ensure they never had to choose between a dream and a paycheck. I wanted to be more than just the old man living in their spare room. I wanted to be their provider one last time. But before I could say a word, I heard the truth. I had moved in with my son Greg 3 years ago after my wife Martha passed away. The house in Columbus had become a mausoleum, and Greg insisted they had plenty of space. "Family takes care of family, Dad," he told me then. I believed him. I didn't mind that they put me in the basement. It was a cold, unfinished space with a small window that looked out at the dirt. But I stayed quiet. I stayed small. I fixed the leaky pipes, I mowed the lawn, and I watched the boys after school. I gave him everything. I raised him to be a man of character, or so I thought. I entered the house through the garage, moving quietly because my knees were aching from the travel. I heard Sarah's voice coming from the kitchen. It was sharp, the kind of tone she never used when she knew I was listening. She was talking to her mother on the phone. "It's not just the space, Mom. It's the cost," she said. "The utility bills are up. His Medicare doesn't cover half of what he needs, and he just sits down there like a ghost. Greg says we owe him because he worked his whole life for us, but I'm done. We found a place in Dayton, Cedar Crest. It's state-funded, so his Social Security will cover the base, and we can finally have our house back." I stood in the hallway, the $4 million receipt clutched in my hand, feeling the air leave my lungs. Cedar Crest. I knew that place. It was a warehouse for the forgotten, a brick box where the heat rarely worked and the hallways smelled of bleach and neglect. They weren't planning a celebration for my return. They were planning my eviction. I stood frozen in that hallway for 5 minutes, listening to the silence that followed Sarah's phone call. The paper in my bag, the one that was supposed to buy their happiness, felt like a lead weight. They didn't want my help. They wanted my absence. I realized then that if I handed Greg that money now, I wasn't being a hero. I was just paying for my own seat at a table where I wasn't welcome. I needed to know if my son was part of this, or if he was just a man being crushed by his wife's resentment. I backed out of the house and drove to a diner 3 miles away to call my attorney, a man named Miller who had handled my business for decades. I told him about the sale, the $4 million, and the conversation I'd just overheard. "Arthur," he said, his voice grave, "you need to move that money into an irrevocable trust immediately. If Sarah tries to file for a guardianship because of your confusion, she could seize every cent before you can blink." We met at his office an hour later. By 5 in the evening, the $4 million was locked away, reachable only by me, protected from any legal stunt they might pull. When I finally returned to the house, I didn't walk in with my head held high. I hunched my shoulders and let my feet drag across the floor. I needed to see their true faces. Sarah was in the kitchen, her expression shifting into a mask of fake sympathy the moment she saw me. "How was the trip, Arthur?" she asked, not even looking up from her tablet. "It was a disaster," I lied, my voice sounding thin and broken. I sat at the table and put my head in my hands. "The buyer backed out. Some issue with the contracts. Not only is there no money, but I had to sign away my personal savings just to cover the legal fees of the collapse." I looked up at her, letting my eyes water. "I'm in debt, Sarah, real debt, about $60,000. The silence was absolute. She didn't offer a hug. She didn't even offer a glass of water. She just stared at me with a look of pure, cold calculation. "Greg will be home soon," she finally said, her voice flat. "We'll have to discuss what this means for the family." That night, lying on my twin mattress in the basement, I listened through the floorboards as they argued. "$60,000, Greg," she hissed. "He's a liability now. We are moving him to Cedar Crest on Monday. I'm calling the intake office tomorrow." I waited for my son to defend me. I waited for him to say, "He's my father. He gave me everything." Instead, I heard a long, defeated sigh. "Do what you have to do, Sarah," he whispered. "I just can't deal with the stress anymore." The next morning, I began the final stage of my test. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the newspaper, holding it upside down. When Sarah walked in, she stopped and asked what I was doing. I blinked at her, letting my eyes unfocus as I muttered that I must just be tired. I saw her pull out her phone and start typing, making notes of my confusion as evidence for the state. The cruelty escalated quickly after that. That afternoon, I wandered the upstairs hallway, pretending to forget where the bathroom was until Sarah found me. She pointed to the door I had walked past twice, and as I shuffled away, she was back on her phone, documenting my incompetence. By the third day, they had cut my food portions. While Greg, Sarah, and the boys ate a full meal, I was given a small scrap of chicken and a few vegetables. I said nothing and retreated to my basement. On the fourth day, the Wi-Fi in the basement was disconnected. When I asked about it, Sarah told me they were cutting costs and that everyone had to make sacrifices. The next day, I found my blood pressure medication moved to a high shelf I couldn't reach. When I asked for help, she sighed as if my survival was an exhausting chore. "I worked my whole life," I whispered to the empty basement walls that night, "and this is the value they place on it." On the sixth day, Greg finally sat me down. He couldn't even look me in the eye. He told me they had been looking into other arrangements, assisted living communities with professional medical staff. "You mean a nursing home, Greg?" I asked, using the name I'd given him 35 years ago. Sarah stepped into the doorway and snapped that I didn't have a choice. She brought up the debt I'd lied about, claiming I was a danger to the family's stability. "I raised him," I said, looking directly at my son. "I gave him everything." Greg didn't answer. He just stood up and walked out of the room, leaving his wife to tell me that the intake at Cedar Crest was scheduled for Tuesday. On Monday morning, I drove to a small coffee shop in downtown Cincinnati to meet Miller. I needed to know the status of the mortgage on Greg's house. Miller had the records pulled. First National Bank held the note, and Greg was 3 months behind. They were 60 days away from the bank starting foreclosure proceedings. "Buy it," I told Miller. "I want the debt, the house, and the title in the name of my trust." It cost me $310,000 to settle the arrears and pay off the remaining balance in full. By Thursday, I legally owned the roof over their heads. That evening, Greg and Sarah sat me down at the kitchen table. They had brochures for Cedar Crest spread out, glossy, dishonest photos of seniors smiling in sunlit rooms. Sarah's voice was bright and brittle as she explained that the appointment was for Saturday morning. "I think you're really going to like the woodworking shop there, Arthur," she said, her eyes already scanning the room as if deciding where her new home gym would go. I looked at the brochures, then at my son, who was staring at his coffee cup as if it held the answers to his cowardice. I felt the coldness settle in my chest, the same coldness I'd felt in that basement for 3 years. "I'm not going," I said. My voice wasn't the thin, quavering whisper I'd been using for the last week. It was the voice of the man who had run a multi-million-dollar company for 40 years. Sarah's fake smile vanished. "Arthur, don't be difficult," she snapped. "We've made the decision. It's what's best for the family." I stood up from the table, and for the first time in years, I saw them both flinch. "I'm not confused, Sarah," I said, my voice cutting through her indignation. "The newspaper, the wandering, the debt. It was all a lie to see what you would do when you thought I had nothing left. I watched the blood drain from Greg's face as he realized he'd been played. You heard us? He whispered. I heard everything, I replied. I heard the old man comments and the plans to warehouse me like a piece of broken furniture. I pulled a manila envelope from my coat pocket and dropped it on top of the Cedar Crest brochures. The sale went through, Greg. I have $4 million in a trust you will never touch, and more importantly, I just bought this house from the bank. You have 30 days to get out. The silence in the kitchen was heavy enough to choke on. Sarah grabbed the envelope and ripped it open, her eyes darting across the legal documents. I watched her face turn from a mask of rage into one of pure, unadulterated terror as she saw the deed transfer. You bought our house, she whispered, the papers trembling in her hands. You bought our house out from under us. I leaned over the table, my hands flat on the wood. I saved you from foreclosure, I corrected her. You should be thanking me. She looked up at me with tears of fury streaming down her cheeks, screaming that I was a monster for manipulating them. I reminded her that she had cut my food portions and moved my medicine while planning to dump me in a state warehouse. I looked at Greg, who was weeping into his hands. I told them that because I was a broke old man in their eyes, they treated me like garbage. But now that I was a millionaire who owned their home, they finally saw me. Greg begged for the children's sake, mentioning Emma and Jack, but I told him they were the ones who were going to lie to those kids about where Grandpa went. I taught them to play chess and fix their toys while their parents were busy calculating how to get rid of me. I told them I was moving out that night to a place where I wasn't a burden, but they had exactly 30 days to pack their lives and find a place that wouldn't let them live on my sweat anymore. I walked out the door and didn't look back. I spent the next 2 weeks in a quiet hotel in Columbus while Miller finalized the paperwork for my new life. I didn't want revenge, but I wanted a shield, so I used a portion of my $4 million to establish a foundation dedicated to elderly advocacy. We called it the Martha Vance Protection Fund, and its sole purpose was to provide legal aid to seniors who were being financially or emotionally exploited by their own families. While I sat in my room, I received dozens of frantic texts from Greg and Sarah, alternating between pleas for forgiveness and venomous accusations. They claimed they couldn't find a rental in Cincinnati that fit their budget, especially with the foreclosure mark on Greg's credit report. I didn't respond to a single one. I thought about the 3 years I spent in that basement, listening to the water heater hum while I waited for a kind word that never came. I realized that I hadn't just raised a son. I had raised a man who allowed his wife to starve and displace his own father for the sake of a home gym. On the 29th day, Miller informed me that the house was vacant. I drove over one last time and stood in the kitchen where they had tried to sign my life away. The Cedar Crest brochures were still sitting in the trash can. I didn't feel joy, and I didn't feel peace. I just felt the cold, hard reality of a family that had been built on a foundation of sand. I changed the locks, put the house on the market, and prepared to move to a small, quiet town in Vermont, where nobody knew me as an old man or a millionaire. I arrived in Woodbridge, Vermont, during a heavy snowstorm that covered the town in a thick, white silence. I bought a small 2-bedroom house near the town green and spent my mornings watching the snow fall while the Martha Vance Protection Fund began its work. My first client was a 72-year-old woman in Ohio whose daughter had been forging her signature to drain her bank accounts. We provided the legal counsel she couldn't afford and secured her a safe apartment away from her own blood. 6 months after I left Cincinnati, my phone rang with an unknown number. It was Greg. He told me that he and Sarah had separated and that she was in therapy for a shopping addiction she had hidden for years by forging his name on loans. He confessed that he had been weak and let her cruelty dictate his life because he was scared. He mentioned that my grandsons missed me and that Jack still kept the toy robot I had fixed for him in that basement. He wasn't asking for money or even for forgiveness. He just wanted me to know he finally understood what he had done. I told him I wasn't ready to go back and I wasn't ready to forgive, but I said he could call me once a month, just to let me know how things were going. I hung up the phone and looked at the winter landscape outside my window. I am 71 years old. I am an engineer, and I am a father who finally stopped being a burden by becoming a stranger. I walked to my desk, opened a new file for the foundation, and began to work on the next case. If this story meant something to you, subscribe. There's more to come.